Welcome back to the Constitutional Clarion. When we think of the right to vote and suffragettes, we usually think of educated, privileged white women. But it seems likely that the first woman to vote in Australia was a black, working, single mother who'd been raised in an orphanage. Her name was Fanny Finch. Fanny's start in life was not the best. She was born in London in 1815. While no one's certain, it seems likely that her parents were servants of African origin who were perhaps emancipated slaves. Fanny was left to be raised at the St Pancras fledgling home where she was trained as a domestic servant. But unlike many women of the era, the fledgling home had given Fanny an education. So she was literate, numerate and confident. Fanny travelled to South Australia at the age of 21 as the servant of the ship's surgeon. She later married a sailor called Joseph Finch with whom she had a family. At least one of their 4 children was severely disabled, and Joseph soon disappeared from the picture, either deserting Fanny or being imprisoned. Fanny became the sole breadwinner and moved her family to the Victorian goldfields to make a living. She ran lodging houses, restaurants and bathing establishments in Castlemaine and its surrounds. Much of what we know about Fanny is gleaned from newspaper advertisements and court reports in those newspapers. She was a larger-than-life figure in the community, being frequently described in the press as the famous Fanny Finch or, sometimes, the notorious Mrs. Fanny Finch. Her notoriety brought her enemies as well as supporters. She was often the subject of police attention. In September 1855, she was charged with deserting her children. This probably actually meant little more than the fact that she was a working mother who was trying to support them. Most of the accusations against her concerned sly grog selling, as alcohol could not be sold on the goldfields without a licence. On one occasion, the police admitted in court that they'd been sent to her establishment to entrap her in illegal alcohol sales. Fanny's lawyer argued that Fanny, quote, though a woman of colour, was as sensitive as a white when pressed hardly by the law, unquote, especially as she had a family to support. He stressed that Fanny had not been such an idiot as to receive money from officers in uniform for alcohol. According to the newspaper report, he then commented on the unfair, un-British and unconstitutional practice of sending around police officers to entrap people. And he asked the judge to abolish the practice, which he said lowered standards in the community. The judge, however, was unsympathetic. Fanny was convicted and she was fined. Now, a month later, in January 1856, Fanny walked defiantly to the Castlemaine Hall to cast her vote in the local municipal elections. The Victorian Municipal Institutions Act of 1854, and yes, for those people who believe local government's only a recent thing, it was around in 1854. It stated that persons who were ratepayers could vote. Now, Fanny was a ratepayer, so she voted, as did another woman. No one stopped them at the time, but it was notable enough for a Melbourne newspaper, the Argus, to record that 2 women voted. One, the famous Mrs. Fanny Finch, gave a plumper, that is a vote, for Mr. Walter Smith, which is noted as an incident of the day. We don't know who the other woman was and what her background was, but we do know that Fanny voted, not only because of the newspaper report, but because we still have a copy of her signed ballot. In those days, before the introduction of the secret ballot, voters signed their ballot paper. A copy of it is held today by the Castlemaine Art Museum. Sadly, the local assessors who oversaw the election ruled that Fanny's vote and that of the other woman were invalid. Why? Upon a closer look at the Act, Section 20 said that ratepayer meant every male person of full age who was required to pay rates. Fanny paid her rates, but she was excluded from voting because she was female. So yes, Fanny voted, but her vote didn't count. Just 5 years later, however, women were given the right to vote in municipal elections in South Australia in 1861, if they were ratepayers. It took much longer, however, to achieve the vote at the legislative level. Even when the more progressive lower houses passed reforms allowing women the right to vote, this was blocked in the more conservative upper houses. In South Australia, the Women's Suffrage League was sophisticated in its political lobbying and determined not to resort to violent or destructive campaigns. They decided to persuade politicians that votes of women could help the politicians get elected. Mary Lee, for example, encouraged working women to join trade unions. Now, this was a stepping stone to then persuading the United Labour Party of South Australia that the votes of these female unionists would vastly improve their electoral prospects, getting them on board for votes for women. In 1893, the Conservative government of John Downer was defeated by the Liberal opposition led by Charles Kingston, critically with the support of the United Labour Party. Kingston was a libertine who seduced women and sired illegitimate children, much to the shock of conservative Adelaide society. He was also irascible. When insulted by an opposing politician, he sent him a pistol and challenged him to a duel in Victoria Square in Adelaide. His opponent dobbed him in to the police, and Kingston was arrested when he arrived at the assigned place with his loaded gun. He was convicted and bound over to keep the peace. The sentence was still in force when his government was elected in 1893, and he became the Premier. Kingston had initially opposed the female franchise, but he was eventually persuaded, including by his Labor colleagues, that votes for women would be politically advantageous for his government. As voting rights were set out in the colony's constitution, a constitutional change was required, and this meant that it had to be passed by an absolute majority in each house and reserved for the Queen's royal assent. The Conservatives in the Parliament vociferously opposed the Constitution Female Suffrage Bill of 1894. They claimed that women didn't want the vote, or were too emotional to vote, or would vote as instructed by their husband or their priest, or would vote for the most handsome candidate. But seeing the writing on the wall that they were going to lose, the Conservatives decided to take the risky tactic of raising the stakes. They moved an amendment to the bill so that if it passed, women could not only vote at elections, but also stand for and become members of Parliament. They thought that this was so radical and absurd that it would persuade other members of Parliament to reject the bill altogether. But this last-minute gamble failed spectacularly. The bill, as amended, was passed, and South Australian women became the first in the world who were entitled not only to vote for Parliament, but to stand for election to Parliament. The Ladies' Gallery of the South Australian Parliament erupted into cheers as the bill passed. The bill still had to be sent to the United Kingdom to get the Queen's assent. Despite the fact that Queen Victoria opposed voting for women, she was more than prepared, by the way, to exercise great power herself, but was not interested in giving greater democratic power to women. Queen Victoria nonetheless, however, gave her assent to the bill at Osborne House on the Isle of Wight on the 2nd of February 1895, and it came into effect in South Australia from the 21st of March 1895. 39,000 women voted at the 1896 South Australian election, which also included referendums on religion in government schools, which were held on the same day. And on that, see my earlier video about those referendums. If you've ever wondered why the date of women getting the right to vote in South Australia is variously given as 1894, 1895 and 1896. It depends on what you count. Is it when the bill was passed in South Australia, which was 1894, when Queen Victoria gave assent to it, 1895, or when the women first actually got to vote at the next election, which was 1896. Prior to that election, Helen Spence published a leaflet called A Few Plain Words to the Women Electors of South Australia to help educate women before they took up their responsibilities as voters. In it, she said this: "If our male relatives, for party purposes, ask us to vote for men whose moral character or political platform we disapprove of, we ought not to do so. If we elect bad men to Parliament, we will have a bad government. If we elect good and able men, we will have a good government." She concluded that women, quote, "do not want to be represented by drunkards, libertines, gamblers, or political adventurers," unquote. And she hoped that the votes of women would lift parliamentary standards. She said that to vote intelligently, women must learn what each candidate intends to do and inquire into his past political history. If he has been false to his promises, do not trust him. Wise words from Helen Spence. We should all vote intelligently and make the effort to know about the candidates that we are actually voting for. Helen Spence became the first female candidate in Australia running for election at the 1897 Constitutional Convention to draft the federal constitution. Her brother had actually suggested that she nominate. At first, she was shocked by the idea, but then she realised that election to the convention would give her the opportunity to argue not only for the female franchise at the federal level, but also for the voting system of proportional representation that she supported, which was known as the Hare-Spence system. She waited until the last minute to submit her nomination, hoping that no one would then have time to challenge her candidacy. Her nomination was accepted, and she gained 7,500 votes, coming 22nd in a field of 33. It's a pity that she wasn't elected, as it would have been really interesting to see how her presence might have affected the convention debates and whether she would have been successful in her advocacy for voting reform. She was a woman of formidable intellect and knowledge about voting systems, so I think her views would have garnered respect from the other delegates had she been elected. Unfortunately, we'll never know. In 1899, women won the right to vote in Western Australia. How? Well, this time, they convinced the Conservative government of Sir John Forrest that giving women the vote would potentially double the number of Conservative voters in Perth, overcoming the votes of the male-dominated goldfields where Forrest faced most of his opposition. It was not principles of equality and rights that won the day with politicians, it was actually political self-interest. Australian suffragists were far more effective at tapping into that self-interest and getting results than their sisters in Britain, who resorted to violence. They were the ones who went out smashing windows, setting letterboxes on fire, putting acid in letterboxes which injured the postman who tried to collect the mail, torching public buildings, slashing artworks, cutting telegraph wires and setting off bombs, including a bomb that was full of nuts and bolts which was attached to the coronation chair in Westminster Abbey, about which see my coronation videos. One British suffragette even threw a hatchet at the Prime Minister, missing him, but cutting another MP on the ear, which of course has its modern-day parallels. Their actions lost the support of many members of the public who got sick of the destruction and did not see their behaviour as showing the responsibility that would earn them the privilege of the franchise. They tried to force change through acts that today would be described as terrorism. But the effect was to actually undermine their cause and delay its success. It was only after the suffragettes changed tack, instead working hard to support the war effort during World War I, that they built the credibility that led to the vote being conferred on at least some women in 1918, well after their Australian sisters. It's a very good example of how reform is more effectively achieved through peaceful means and intelligent lobbying, rather like Helen Spence's intelligent voting. This means looking at the interests of the people you are trying to persuade and devising ways that can achieve both your interests and theirs together. In my experience, having worked in government, the most effective lobbyist I ever encountered was the one who came to me and said, "How can we help you," which was the New South Wales government, "to achieve what you need," being X and Y, while also achieving at least some of what we want, which is Z. Offering cooperative reform and assistance is so much more effective than issuing demands, making threats and engaging in violence. It's the greatest lesson in negotiation that I learned, and it's one that I've used to great effect ever since. Thank you again for watching the Constitutional Clarion. I hope you found this little piece of history interesting, and as always, I look forward to seeing you next time. Goodbye.